Hello my friends, today's topic is whole sign houses, quadrant houses, and equal houses. These are three different kinds of house systems, and I'm going to suggest to you that they represent three different models for astrology. Not only are they different house systems, but the assumptions, the way we look at the astrology chart is very, very different, implies different things, and even leads you to use different astrological techniques. So it really sets up three different paradigms for how you're going to look at the chart. It's more than just three different house systems. That's the, you might say, the argument I'm going to make. I think you're going to find this interesting. So here's a chart wheel over here. I'm in the Series 1.3 software. This is the chart of Steffi Graph. We have a tropical chart and Placidus houses. And here we see what happens in a quadrant house system, where this dark line with the arrow here is the 10th house cusp. And here's the 10th, 11th, and 12th houses. So we divide from the 10th house cusp to the first house cusp into three sections, and similarly first, second, and third houses, and so on. So these are the quadrants. We divide them into sections, and as you know, there are different ways of dividing these quadrants. This happens to be the Placidus houses. You know, we have Campanus and Porphyry and Regiomontanus and Coke, and other ones that disagree about where to put what we call the intermediate cusps, how to divide these quadrants. Okay, so you have the quadrant house system, you have the whole sign house system, and the equal house system. So let's click on settings, click on house system, change it. What do I want to do here? Let me show you the whole sign houses. So I click on whole sign, and here what happens is the house is a sign. The first house is Gemini. The ascendant is placed in the house. This all didn't quite fit, so it overlapped into the next house. But this is 26 Gemini, which is still over here in Gemini. So these are all the first house. By the way, this symbol here is the north node, and this symbol here, if you see my arrow right after the ascendant, you may not be familiar with, is the part of spirit, and we're using the in this particular chart wheel, the modern method of calculating the part of fortune, and the part of spirit using the ancient method is actually the part of fortune. Well, anyway, it's nice to have both. That way, for people who use the part of spirit becomes the part of fortune when the sun is below the ascendant, which is actually the sun's not below the ascendant, because here's the ascendant here, 26 Gemini. The sun is above the ascendant, even though it's in the first house, using whole sign houses. Okay, well, anyway, you have whole sign houses. It's a very, very different model. Well, let's look at these three models and see how they look at the chart so differently from each other. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is the intuition behind these three kinds of house systems appears to be very different. Now, when I say appears to be, in astrology, we're handed down these rules, and people say, here's how you calculate houses, and they give you a quadrant house system and say to use whole sign. There is not very much information on why you would do this or what the implications are, so we have to kind of extrapolate and figure out what people might have been thinking. And I'm going to suggest that the techniques used with whole sign houses in Vedic astrology versus classical astrology reflect a different intuition. In other words, in Vedic astrology, very frequently whole sign houses are used. In classical astrology, which means medieval astrology, people started using quadrant houses. For example, in the later Middle Ages, early Renaissance period, the quadrant house system becomes more popular. Particularly Regiomontanus was used, and then when modern astrology picked up on the later classical tradition, it also used the quadrant houses. And some of the astrological methods and techniques used in the later classical period and then inherited in modern times reflect this emphasis on the quadrant house system. Now, let me mention this word intuition. When I say the intuition, I'm using the word intuition as it's used in mathematics, which means the feeling or sense of an idea. I don't mean intuition as like something separate from logic, but intuition here means the common sense feeling image behind the specific details. So getting an intuition often helps when you learn the details. In mathematics, often the idea of an intuition is used. For example, the online school developed by Sal Khan called Khan Academy. If you've ever taken the courses there, I've watched many of them. They're wonderful, incredibly good courses. And what Sal does when he teaches the math things, he often will give the intuition behind the idea. Say it's calculus, he'll give the intuition. Why do we have these calculations? And then he goes into details. It's very, very helpful. So often there's an intuition, an image, a concept behind the specifics. And I want to talk about what the intuition appears to be behind these three different kinds of house systems. All right, the whole sign houses. Here's the idea. There are no houses. I mean, in a way, you could say house systems don't exist. There are just zodiac signs. So you can look at the houses as really just meaning relative signs, right? So if you're in the sign of Leo, you're in the third sign relative to the sign that the ascendant is in. So the ascendant is in Gemini, and Leo is simply the third sign relative to the ascendant. And I think that this is the way that a lot of astrologers traditionally were thinking about whole signs, especially in Vedic astrology. And we'll see how a lot of the ideas in, for example, Vedic astrology reflect this. So what does Virgo mean? It means it's the fourth sign from whatever sign was rising. So in a sense, you can just get rid of the idea of houses and think of houses as just relative signs. Virgo is the fourth sign relative to the ascendant. That's the way to think about it. Just get rid of houses and think of it as a relative sign, relative to some other sign. Now, if that's your intuition, that there are no houses, there are just relative signs, and we'll call signs in how they're relative to another sign, we'll call that a house, just as a convenience. Just means how many signs away one thing is from another. All right, well, here's some of the consequences of thinking that. One is you don't have to just have the ascendant. The ascendant is just one spot. So you can, for example, count from wherever the moon is. Now, for Steffi Graf, the moon is also in Gemini. But let's pick some other point. Let's pick, well, in Steffi's case, it's hard to find a good obvious one, but let's say from Mars. So you could start from Mars, and you could say from Mars, Sagittarius is the first house. They're just relative signs. And in fact, in Vedic astrology, the Chandra Lagna, Chandra is a word for moon, Lagna means the first house, or what we're going to regard as an ascendant. You can count from the moon. Well, for Steffi, sun, moon, and ascendant are all Gemini, so they end up being the same, but you get the idea. You can count from basically any point, and because the moon is so important in Vedic astrology, you can count from the moon. So, you might, when you first learn about these ideas, think, oh, this is crazy. You can counting houses from any point, but really, the real house system is where the ascendant is. That's not true in whole sign houses. You can just count from any point. The reason why the ascendant is so important is because the ascendant is the point that's rising. The word horoscope means the chart of the hour. The ascendant is like a starting point for the individual, and it's a very powerful starting point, but it's not the only one. Okay, so one result of using whole sign houses is it's very compatible. It fits in well with the sign of whole sign houses to start from any point. So that's the intuition, and then the specific methods fit into that intuition. If I can count from any point, then I can have Chandra Lagna, just like I can have the usual Lagna ascendant as the beginning of the first house. And in Vedic astrology, the Chandra Lagna is very important. And it makes sense. So I'm just showing how you look at the chart and how the techniques used fit into the overall concept. Now, number two is that if a sign is a house, and houses are just relative signs, then everything's relative. You look at everything relative to everything. So, for example, the 11th house is relative to the 10th house is number 2. It's the second house from the 10th. And in Vedic astrology, what do they say about the 11th house? A lot of emphasis on money, money, money. Because career is where you get money, and so this is the money derived from the career. So the 11th house, for some Vedic astrologers, is just as much a money house as the 10th house. And if you're not used to thinking about whole sign houses, you might think, gee, they're making too much out of being a relative to the 10th. But again, do you see how the concept makes sense? That's what houses are. They're just relative. They're just relative to some other thing. There is no such thing as a house. They're just relative signs. So you can take everything relative to everything. So the 11th house is a big money house. So when you get this intuition, this like paradigm, this concept, that a house is just a relative sign, it all begins to make sense. Take my signs from anywhere. Take them from the ascendant, take them from the moon, take them from the part of fortune, take them from wherever you want. That's fine, and take houses relative to each other. Now, we have these ideas in modern astrology, 8th house is your partners, money, etc. We do use it, but you'll find in Vedic astrology, they use these relative houses extensively. They use other ascendants, particularly the moon as an ascendant, extensively. It's not a secondary, minor thing. These are ingrained in the whole way astrology is done. And it makes sense given the concept that there are no houses. They're just relative signs. Okay. So you get a different emphasis when you think of signs, think of houses as just being signs. Okay, a third way. Well, you don't need a round wheel. Other images fit in well. If a sign is a house, it's nice. And even in medieval astrology, not only in Vedic astrology, I'll right-click on this wheel. I'll change the style to a square wheel. This is a wheel very commonly used in the Middle Ages. In the medieval, they put the ascendant here on the left, was common, and some of the Vedic, you tend to put it up here. But it's the same idea, same shape, a little bit different. But this begins to make sense also because you just want to get a visualization of how the signs are all related to each other. So this works out well. And this particular way of drawing a chart wheel puts the cardinal houses all in the middle, and then there's an arrangement for the the succedent and cadent houses out here, and it becomes a nice image to see these relationships of the houses for each other, and it becomes an attractive way to do it because each sign is a house, and it just works out nicely to just draw it any way you want to. You don't get this complexity that we have. I'll cancel out of this and go back to the wheel where we have signs that are different from houses. They're the same thing. So that's another consequence. These other chart wheels that are not round fit in nicely with the idea of using whole sign houses. And the idea that astrology is a kind of cosmic game is easier to figure out because you have these nice little neat packages. I talk about that in a separate video on Introduction to Vedic Astrology. So all these things fit together. How you draw your wheel, how you look at things, the methods you use. You have these nice, neat little boxes that everything fits into, and you have just one concept, signs, and all the way that the different zodiac signs are related to each other. And lastly, I want to mention that whole sign houses is a really nice idea with sidereal astrology. And of course, Vedic astrology generally uses the sidereal zodiac because each sign is some specific group of stars. So really what you're looking at if you're doing sidereal astrology with whole sign houses, as is done in Vedic astrology, you're looking at how groups of stars are all related to each other. So the group of stars that is Pisces for Steffi Graf, they're in a fourth house relationship or 4 signs away from the stars that are in Sagittarius. So you're looking at the relationship of distances, relative distances between groups of stars. Now you can use whole sign houses with a tropical zodiac. That also works out very well. and lots of people do, and that's more common in the Western tradition, in Hellenistic astrology, as it's used today and as it's understood. It's generally tropical whole sign, so you can do that as well. It fits very well. But with sidereal, if you're using sidereal astrology, it's a real natural combination because you're basing your astrology on the stars, and you're seeing how far apart the stars are from each other. Well, that's maybe a weaker point. I think the stronger points, if I go back, are the first 2 points. If you're using signs equals houses, relative signs is an obvious idea, and doing your chart from any point. These first 2 are the big ones. Third and fourth, more arguable, maybe more subtle, but I thought I'd mention them anyway. So that's whole sign houses. Some of the implications of it and the ways you tend to interpret the chart, if you use whole sign houses, some ideas that tend to make sense and fit into it well. I'm not suggesting if you use whole sign houses you have to come up with those ideas. What I am suggesting is the evolution of thought follows a consistent pattern. A model was developed, and based on that model and visualization, certain techniques become natural to develop. You can develop any ideas you want to. I'm not suggesting you're limited to that, but I'm explaining how the history and development of astrological thought was probably affected by the paradigm, the model that was used, and what the implications of using a whole sign house system had, particularly on Vedic astrology. Now, quadrant houses. This is a whole different world. The quadrant houses, instead of having this like board game with these 12 little 12 boxes that everything is arranged in and how those boxes are related to each other, you have a whole different way of thinking about the skies. What you're seeing is the drama of the rise and fall of the stars. So let's go ahead and change Steffi's chart back to a quadrant house system. So I'll go to Settings, House System, and select, well, it doesn't matter. Let's select Regiomontanus. So there's Regiomontanus houses. Now what you're getting here is the emphasis that the sun rises. Well, she was born just after sunrise. Sun's right above the horizon here, and then it comes up and it culminates here. It has a longer arc to reach, and this is its pinnacle, and then it sets. So the emphasis is on this diurnal motion of the planets, and all the planets rise here, culminate here, set here, anti-culminate, reach their lowest point here. There's some technical astronomical issues related to this I talk about in the videos on astronomy for astrologers and on In Mundo. I'm not going to get into that here, but that's the basic idea, is this emphasis on the diurnal cycle. You don't have this emphasis with whole sign houses. I mean, you can include that idea if you want to. I'm not suggesting you can't. All I'm saying is that historically, the people that use quadrant houses tend to be thinking more in this way. That's all I'm saying. They're thinking more about rising, culminating, setting. It's a more visual emphasis. It's also more complex. You tend to think about the astronomy, the way that the planets rise and culminate with these different distances. Depends on your latitude of birth, depends on what sign is rising. The signs rise at different speeds. All of this becomes relevant, of course, very relevant, when you're looking at the sky in this way, as the planets in their diurnal cycle. So the quadrant house system is more closely tied to these facts. All stars appear. The fact that they rise, they just come out of the underworld, the hidden below the earth, and then blink, they appear, they rise in the east. So you get this big emphasis on the rising, the drama, the drum roll, the trumpets blaring. Here comes the sun, here comes Mercury, here comes Sirius. They rise, and the stars rise at certain times of the year. And then they're going to rise and rise and rise, and they reach their peak, the pinnacle, the crescendo at the midheaven. So you get this drama, the daily drama. All the stars rise, just like the sun does in the east. They rise from the underworld. They rise from the dead. Now keep in mind, if the Jungian perspective and people like Joseph Campbell, how our minds follow mythic stories. So sometimes these are even unconscious images. uh, that pervade the astrological thought and the astrology and the world view, the psychology, the sense of what life is all about, are all intertwined. And this is a whole different image. You see some of the Christian mythology here of, rising in the east, rising from the dead, etc. And it's ingrained in a lot of our Western culture and our Western astrology. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's a way of thinking about astrology, an image, a paradigm, mythic sensitivities that are all mostly unconsciously ingrained in how we're thinking about the chart. And it has concrete effects on what methods we're going to use. Some of the techniques we tend to use if you use quadrant house systems. Again, you tend to use. I'm not saying you can't use these if you use whole sign houses. Of course you can. And many people do. But it's a stream of thought. It's a way of thinking that strongly influences astrological traditions, and you will find these ideas more commonly emphasized when people use quadrant house systems. More common, not strict division, but more commonly. An emphasis on rising, culminating, setting, of course, because that's what this chart is. You don't see that with whole sign houses. This is very important in classical astrology. The same tradition of astrology that emphasizes quadrant houses, emphasizing this rising, culminating, setting, and lower culmination. Primary directions, a major forecasting method used in classical astrology, heavily used by Kepler and Quadrant and other late medieval astrologers. They were astronomers as well, and they're studying this diurnal cycle and how the planets, the speed at which they're moving in their diurnal motion, and trying to relate that to your future, is all based on this way of looking at the chart, this quadrant-style way of looking at the chart. And these two traditions overlap. The astrology charts done by Kepler with that square wheel style more often than the round style. So, well, I don't know if it's more often, but a lot of the charts I've seen that Kepler actually drew were the square wheels. So, this isn't a strict division, but a tendency for this quadrant house system to be associated with a round wheel and with this cyclic approach, and you get an emphasis on methods like primary directions. What do they use in Vedic astrology? Dasas, planetary periods, which fits in better with a whole sign house approach. Okay, and as I've started to say, number two, if you're going to think about quadrant houses, it gets you involved with some pretty complex astronomy. And the use of spherical trigonometry, particularly after about the 1600s, to figure out how the planets are moving, what their distance is from the midheaven. You're not just using the ecliptic plane. You're putting a lot of emphasis on equatorial coordinates, ways of thinking, because the planets move differently in their diurnal cycle than they do in their proper motion the other way through the zodiac. It makes you visualize how the sky is working and the interaction of these things, and it kind of stretches your brain to think about how to calculate and figure out these things. So we have the emphasis of people like Kepler and Quadrant, who are astronomers and mathematicians, as well as astrologers, and work with this emphasis. So a whole different way of thinking about astrology as this dynamic, diurnal process, and the techniques that are associated with it. You get the emphasis on visual astrology as you see these things happen, because these are things you can watch during the day. And as I think I've started to mention, specific techniques, the time it takes for a zodiac sign to rise. This is used as far back as Hellenistic astrology and some of the forecasting methods. The planets that rise, culminate, set, and anti-culminate with a star. This is a very important thing in some of the classical astrological traditions. Also, parallels of declination, which I talk about in the videos on astronomy for astrology. This appears to be an idea introduced much later, perhaps in the 1800s, from the historical research that I've read from other astrologers. Parallels of latitude were sometimes used earlier. As more research is done into the ancient stuff, we may find out that parallels of declination go back further in time than we currently realize right now. But when astrology is revived in the late 1800s, in the theosophical tradition, and it gets revived from where it left off at the in about the late 1600s and early 1700s, when it dies out there, astrology kind of fades into the background for a couple hundred years. It picks up with the emphasis of what was used at that time period, which is the quadrant house systems. The Placidus houses become very popular, and people are thinking about these motions. So it's not surprising that parallels of declination get picked up, because parallels of declination are closely related to the diurnal motion, this motion of stars rising and culminating. When planets are parallel, they're following the same path through the sky. And the path through the daily motion, the diurnal motion, the paths of these stars and planets are parallel to each other. Anyway, that's all in another video where I describe that astronomy. Now, lastly, the equal house system. This is the third paradigm. So one paradigm is there are no houses. They're just relative signs. And the way the signs are relative to each other, we call those houses. And then there's this more dramatic approach of the rising and culminating and setting and anti-culminating of the planets, the quadrant system. Then there's a third way, maybe the least popular of the three methods. Well, I don't know. Equal houses are fairly common, but it really represents a third paradigm. And I think that this third paradigm has less of a history behind it. It's maybe an idea for the future. It may not be a better idea, but I think it's an ascending idea. There's bad puns, since we're talking about ascendants and so on. But maybe an ascending idea, or a newer idea of equal houses. And the idea behind equal houses, if I go here to settings, house system, and I select equal, well, of course they're equal. Ascendant's 26 Gemini, 26 Cancer, 26 Leo, 26 Virgo. As we go around, they're all the same degree. This at first may seem like, kind of a simple, stupid idea, like I'm just going to take equal houses around. It's no longer related to the quadrants. It's no longer related to whole sign houses. What's the deal there? Well, maybe people just thought of it for any old reason, but there's some interesting realization that you can have, which is that these equal houses imply that the intersection of great circles, I have here at the top, intersections of great planes or great circles create zodiac houses. So the interesting thing is that our tropical zodiac, this zero Aries point, is where one great circle, the ecliptic plane, intersects another great circle, the equatorial great circle, the equatorial plane, and the ascendant is where the ecliptic plane, which is one great circle, intersects another great circle, the horizon plane. So the ascendant is very similar to zero Aries. They're extremely similar. They're both where some great circle intersects the ecliptic plane. An extremely similar astronomical basis to zero Aries and the ascendant. And since zero Aries and the ascendant are extremely similar, and zero Aries creates a cycle of 12 phases, each of 30 degrees, maybe the ascendant also creates 12 phases of 30 degrees. So by using equal houses, you've made the houses operate exactly like signs. And the principle behind it is that the intersection of two great planes creates a cycle. So this could be a theoretical framework for equal houses. This has certain implications. One is that the intersection of two great circles creates a zodiac, in which case you might want to do equal houses from the midheaven. Here's the midheaven over here. And in Sirius software, I can go to settings, house system, and select equal from the midheaven. So we start with the midheaven and go around. And we could do a bi-wheel if we wanted, with equal and from the ascendant in the middle and equal from the midheaven on the outside. But this is something that would make sense given this paradigm. And this paradigm, this model, that the intersection of great circles creates 12 phases, also gets related, excuse me, gets related to the idea of fractals, in that what happens with fractals is you have the three-dimensional circle gets reduced to the 2 dimensions of the great circle, and so get this emphasis on data reduction of how the sky gets reduced to particular planes. That's maybe a little abstract to you right now. I've got some videos all about that on the theoretical framework based on that. But the more practical thing is just that it changes our astrology. Instead of being an emphasis on the drama of rising and culminating, or the emphasis on zodiac signs as everything, and houses are just relative zodiac signs, to looking at the importance of the intersection of great circles and how they create phases of 30 degrees. 12 cycles of 30 degrees. So there you have it, my friends. 3 different models for astrology with their own implications and the techniques that they imply. Mostly the emphasis historically has been on whole sign versus quadrant, and that's been the emphasis of this talk. And then also this idea of equal houses, maybe a new idea that presents a different way of looking at astrology. Okay, and that's it. Last thing I want to say is that somebody may be right and somebody may be wrong. Maybe whole sign houses are right and quadrant house systems are wrong, or they're all right in different ways. We don't know which models are correct. We don't know if astrology even produces measurable effects or if it's divination. There are different points of view. And I want to just say, being wrong is not the worst thing in the world. There's a wonderful book by Mario Livio called Brilliant Blunders that scientists have made. So maybe some of us are making some brilliant blunders, not the worst thing in the world. Through the process of pursuing these different ideas, a lot of knowledge and information and perspectives and insights are gained about astronomy and ways of looking at things, and eventually we may sort out who's right, who's wrong, or if everybody's right in different ways. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because there are all these different ideas and different models and different people who align themselves with different approaches. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. God bless. Namaste.